You're listening to WonderLabs, so fill your ear holes with nerdy goodness.
Hello and welcome to WonderLabs. I'm Ellie Mackay.
And I'm Chris Richardson.
This episode is a slightly different format to our usual conversations. We speak with Professor Sir Lord Robert Winston. Lord Winston is Professor of Science and Society and Emeritus Professor of Fertility Studies at Imperial College London. He has also had a prolific career as a medical doctor, television presenter and politician.
This is more of a meta-conversation about contemporary challenges in science communication. We discuss evidence denial and post-truth, the role of governments in individual well-being, and find out why Lord Winston is focusing his efforts on younger audiences as an educational strategy. We also find out which research areas he's most excited about for the future, as well as his favourite Jewish joke.
Lord Winston has had a rock star career, and we were lucky to grab some time from his schedule for this interview. Behind the fame and accolades, he is genuine, down-to-earth, and really fun to speak with.
Please enjoy this conversation with Professor Sir Lord Robert Winston. You do wear many different hats in your various roles in academia, research, politics. How would you describe what you do?
Well, they're all crumpled hats, I think it's fair to say, but I try to spend my mornings in the college and my afternoons are quite often spent in Westminster because there's quite a lot of politics going on which is relevant to science and medicine. But I do a huge amount of outreach for the college outside normal working hours, so I would be visiting 2, 3 or 4 schools a week perhaps, often going to different universities to give public lectures, and also I give quite a lot of public lectures to other organisations around the country a lot of the time, and that excludes all the other things I do which include writing and other organisations I'm involved with. I mean, one of the things I'm very proud of is being part of the Royal College of Music, which of course has been a fantastic experience, really.
Great, and it seems a lot of that work is unified under this common theme of communication and engagement with the public. Given that we can't all become experts in everything, what degree of literacy and scientific literacy do you think is something that's achievable and something we should be aiming for?
It's a very good question, and I think for me, my basic premise is that science literacy involves understanding that science really isn't nearly as difficult as people say it is. That actually, essentially, science is very, very logical. I mean, I know when you get to quantum mechanics and the rest of it, it stops being at all logical, but by and large, for most people. So I remember on one occasion being asked by a 9-year-old, he says, "Tell me, how do you know all this stuff?" And I said, well, the truth is I don't know the stuff at all. I make it up as I go along because, of course, basically the thing about science is you can work it out from basic principles, and it's really much easier than learning a language or doing most of the other things that one has to do as part of one's learning process. So I think that's one issue. But to come back to the genesis of your question, if I may, I think we don't really need to train more and more scientists of the future. I mean, that's obviously what the mission of the college is to a large extent, and it should be, of course, it must be. But in the broader context, what we do need to be able to do is to take much wiser decisions about how we use the technology that we are initiating. And that's really missing in our society, whether it's genetically modified crops or genetically modified humans or the use of CRISPR, for example. Pretty well anything, animal research, antibiotic resistance, all these things require wider literacy so that actually people can take proper decisions as it affects us and them.
So often we don't aim for knowledge's sake, but try and frame this knowledge in the context of something that's useful to people, something they can use to inform their decision making, particularly when it comes to politics and voting. In this so-called post-truth era, how do we combat this rising trend in evidence denial when it comes to topics like climate change and vaccines and even this new movement of flat earthers?
Well, of course, if I could answer that question, it would be brilliant, but nobody can answer the question. That's why you ask it. Let me start off with this premise. The basic fact is probably that science itself has no moral question. The ethics of science come in the way we use it. So I think one of the problems we have to understand as scientists is that the things that we do are knowledge, and knowledge itself doesn't have an ethical dimension, but that dimension becomes very important when we start to promulgate or benefit or harness it or use it for disadvantage. And of course all of those things are possible, and there's not a single piece of technology that humans have invented since the hand axe that doesn't have a downside, that doesn't have a dark side to it. And that's something which I think is a fundamental message which good science communication should get across. But it has to be seen in perspective. So, for example, if you're in view of trying to persuade people that perhaps it's worth thinking about animal research in a more constructive way, you also have to recognise that there are ethical issues which are perfectly justified. And whilst I don't have a problem with embryo research, for example, there'll be other people who have quite rigid views, which I think are rigid, where they think this is a human being, and that has to be respected. So I think one of the things we really need in public engagement, and I'm widening your question a little bit, we need to be really quite modest. I think there's a need to be quite humble when we're communicating, and I think there's a need also to be prepared to do something which we don't do very well, which is to listen to what people are saying. We're ready to talk but not to listen, and it's very easy when you come from a place like Imperial College to think you're a master of the universe.
Leading on from this denial of evidence, often that stems from a fear or reluctance of new technology, a good example being mitochondrial transfer, which you spoke out quite vocally about in support of. And often that conflict between new scientific technology can be based on the conflict between science and religion. Your documentary, The Story of God, in that you explored religion in society, you said absolute certainty in either science or religion can lead to serious problems. So why would absolute certainty in science be a bad thing?
We only have to look at what happened to Oppenheimer to realise that absolute certainty was a bad thing. And of course, Oppenheimer subsequently deeply regretted that certainty. And of course, that is something which happens in every aspect of science. And it's very easy to say, of course, we are certain that mitochondrial transfer will be completely safe for the baby. But of course, we can't be certain. You mentioned mitochondrial disease, and it's particularly interesting because there was a lot of parliamentary debate. And
sure, yeah.
Yes, you're right, I did speak on that subject. But the more I think about it, to my mind, mitochondrial transfer is not an issue for Parliament at all. These decisions have to be taken by the individuals who are affected by it. And to my mind, the most important people there are the parents who are contemplating this. And what we have to do as scientists is to give them as accurate a view, which is completely dispassionate and completely disinterested, of what the dangers might be. After that, they have to take that decision. I don't think, and this is the mistake I think that parliamentarians sometimes make, is that somehow parliamentarians are protecting society. Actually, we don't, and we shouldn't be basing our ethics on society. Ultimately, that's what the Nazis did. The Nazis believed they could improve the German race. They were going to improve their society. That's what the eugenicists did in England, or tried to do, in the turn of the century. So I think, the first World Eugenics Congress was at Imperial College. The people who attended were all great and good. We would look back now in horror at really what was being thought about. Forcible sterilization, for example. So I think we have to be very, very clear of what our ethical principles are in all this. And I think that is really the root of this. That's this issue of certainty. And to my mind, the principal ethical judgment is probably the notion, this is using a religious term, but it's not meant to be a religious idea, but it's the idea of the sanctity of human life, the preciousness of human life, the preciousness of our humanity. And it seems to me that that means respecting the autonomy of individuals in society because they are the humans, not necessarily the society because societies go wrong. And there may be times when actually societies collectively do terrible things. And of course that's often borne by a kind of certainty. So yes, I think both religion and science, when they're certain, are dangerous.
You spoke there about the importance of autonomy of the individual and the decision-making being placed in the hands of the public. You're a well-known advocate of science education. You have the Reach Out lab here in Imperial, and of course you've written the utterly amazing books for children. I wanted to ask you why you chose that particular age group, and what age do you think is the right age to be targeting?
That's a brilliant question. I'm increasingly of the view that we're not really going to change science education in secondary school. I think we're reinventing the wheel all the time. We're changing examinations, we're changing processes, we're not looking at things in a different way. But the brain which is most plastic is the much earlier brain. And what we have at the moment in primary schools are 8-year-olds who are without any kind of rules, so they can ask any kind of question, which no teacher can easily answer, even if they're scientifically qualified, and 90% certainly of science teachers have no science qualification. So there is a real problem there, because they don't have the tools really to answer those questions. And in my view, we need to be taking primary school teaching much more seriously, respect primary school teachers far more, because the attitudes that the 8 and 9-year-old have, by the age of 11, they're imprinted, and then when they go to the senior school, they're actually already turned off science or mathematics, whatever it might be. And I think that's one of the reasons, actually, and this is a very controversial thing I'm going to say, I think one of the reasons why we're finding it very difficult to get more women into the physical sciences, for example, physics and chemistry, is not because women can't do these things. Of course they can do them equally well as men, but unfortunately their role models at primary school were not people who understood physics or chemistry because they never did those degrees at university as primary school teachers. teachers. They might have done biology very occasionally, but it's exceptionally unusual to find a primary school teacher who's actually got an understanding of the physical sciences. So kids are brought up by a wonderful female model, amazing teacher, but actually fundamentally can't really come to grips with that. And that, I think, does affect girls very substantially. So I wonder if that isn't a big problem. So to answer your question, what I've done in partnership with Dorling Kindersley, who published these lovely books, and of course they do a huge amount of work, and the illustrations obviously are fantastic, and I'm piggybacking onto that totally. What we've decided collectively is that we really want to go for a young populace. As you rightly say, it's mainly concentrated on 8 to 11, but some of these books, one I'm doing at the moment, is really meant for about 6 and 7-year-olds, but it could be read a little bit older.
Sure.
Now, what is interesting is, of course, is that there's never been a market for non-fiction for kids. It's really quite difficult to break into that market, but that seems to be changing a bit. And, I mean, we're never going to be bestsellers.
Why do you think that is, that it's changing?
Well, I think it's changing because we're beginning to recognise as a society that actually science is hugely useful. Parents understand that getting on in our society might mean that you have to be a bit more scientifically literate. And also, of course, I mean, I don't know about you, but I know that when I was 7, I mean, the greatest present I ever had was a chemistry set. You couldn't get that now because it would be too dangerous. You know, it was amazing to have something like that. But the idea of doing something which is, a bit risky and might make a big bang or a bit of... What we've forgotten a bit is that actually we can trust children to take sensible risks and to understand risk, and actually to some extent we're risk averse. I mean, when I was at school, I was going on a 45-minute journey across London to my school from the age of 8, and a 10-minute walk across the park to get there, to get to the tube station in the dark. And nobody thought that was dangerous. We've become very, very risk averse now. And I think sometimes that's not to the advantage of kids. When teachers are frightened of doing practical science because they think it might be dangerous in their school classroom, they might want to look at see what we're doing in the research lab, which is usually much more ambitious than they would ever dream of doing in school.
Did you have a moment when you were 7 or 8 years old where you had one of those Eureka wow moments with science?
It was later. I was 13 because we didn't do science in my school. Don't forget, this is in the 50s. I'm very old. I remember the year, it was in 1953. I was 13. Maybe 12, 13. And there was this boring old master who looked about 95, stood in front of the class of this boys' school with his hands behind his back, wittering on about chemistry, completely turning us off for 10 minutes. And it was utterly, devastatingly boring. And we sat there, but being fairly polite, we didn't do anything because it was that sort of school. And then, amazingly, quite suddenly behind him, there was a most monumental explosion and the entire room was filled with smoke. Of course, he'd set this up. And from that moment on, all we wanted to do was to make explosions. It was astonishing, actually. So that was a kind of Eureka moment, I think, really.
And so what you're doing at the Reach Out Lab is creating those moments?
I think now we feel a bit more reflective, and so we're trying to look at the basis behind the practical work. I think some kids are not turned on by practical science. I mean, my friend Jim Al-Khalidi, who of course you'll know, as a physicist, Jim says that when he was at school, he wasn't at all interested in practical science. He was interested in working stuff out. There are a group of kids who really will not want to get their hands wet anyway. But for most people, I think practical science is a very good entry into science.
Okay, thank you. Can we finish with some quick questions for you? If you weren't a scientist, what job do you think you would do and why?
Oh God, that's so difficult. There's nothing I wouldn't want to do, really. I mean, I'm a grasshopper, so I mean, I get different interests all the time. I'd like to think I'd be a musician, but I wouldn't be good enough.
Okay, thank you.
Which emerging field or technology most excites you at the moment? Something that we should be following?
I think in biology it's neuroscience, because the whole notion of human consciousness is of key importance to biology and to us.
Where do you think that will take us?
Very interesting question. If we're really going to go into machine learning and artificial intelligence, then actually that becomes a very, very important piece of science. So I think there are very serious reasons why we need to understand how the brain works better. And at the moment, we're very primitive in our understanding. I mean, imaging has done very little for understanding how we think or learn. Genetics has not helped. So, of course, we've got optogenetics and various other techniques. But when you look at electrical activity or other sorts of things you can do in the brain, it's a huge black hole, actually, in biology.
And there's a lot going on there as well. So you've got a lot of the publicly funded research, but then you've got ventures from the likes of Elon Musk and Neuralink coming out. What do you think about the relative importance of business and academia in answering these questions?
I think people like Musk are really, I don't use the word very often, but I think they're inspirational. I think we overuse the word inspirational, but what Musk has done in so many areas, I think without him, we would be further behind, for example, in carbon-free transport. There's no question, whatever we we think about those expensive cars they're producing, they've really changed the nature of the game in a way that few people could have done. Even though we've been experimenting with electrical power, of course, at Imperial College for a very long time, it required somebody commercially to see that vision. Perhaps Dyson is another of those sorts of people, you know, and that's why, of course, we're delighted to have his support at the college.
Do you have a particular pet peeve of a topic or an idea that is often frustratingly misunderstood?
I suppose it comes back to the biggest question of all, which is, you know, how you got that extraordinary change at the start of the universe and what we expanded into. I mean, that seems to be completely impossible to conceptualize, doesn't it? Well, beyond conceptualize anyway. So I think if I was looking at something which was totally puzzling to me as a non-physicist cosmologist, that would be, I think, something which is utterly extraordinary idea. And what I suppose amazes me is that people in the physical sciences are able to grasp those concepts and then work mathematically from them, but still not actually bother with the original puzzle, because of course that's what they don't do. And I remember talking to some physics teachers, and I said, you know, okay, tell me, how do you explain that an electron with a slit experiment can be in two different places simultaneously? And he said, well, I don't go down that route. But I just thought,
brilliant.
That's what we do in so many of these issues. We ignore them.
What's your favourite piece of lab equipment?
I think it's got to be a simple light microscope. And the reason why is because once you have looked down a simple light microscope at relatively low power, you see the beauty of things that you didn't dream was possible. And that really hooked me into my research. I mean, my early research was mesmerised by the sight of the fallopian tube, actually, and the exquisite beauty of how the egg is transported down that conduit. It's not just a simple pipe, it's really complicated. And it was the microscope which showed me that. The great thing about the light microscope is that what you're seeing is something you can believe in. You know, when you come to DNA, you have to really, do you really believe in it? You know, I mean, you know, is it really there? And what does it really look like? What's the structure of protein actually? I know we've got these X-rays, but it's very difficult. Well, with the light microscope, you can see it working. And there's something simple about that, which, you know, if you're not very bright, that's a very good way of looking at stuff.
Brilliant. So, final question then. Could you tell us your favourite science joke?
Well, I suppose it's about prediction, but it's not really a science joke, but it involves the notion of how we predict things and do so inadequately. And it's a Jewish joke, really. This man goes to his rabbi and says, you know, Rabbi, I'm quite a good cricketer, and I play cricket, and I'm really concerned because I'm beginning to lose my faith, because nothing I've heard in synagogue really persuades me that they play cricket in the world to come. And the rabbi said, what do you want? He said, well, can you reassure me they do play cricket? And he said, well, it can't really. He said, but I could go and ask some of the sources. So he goes off to the court of judges and they stroke their beards and they don't come to a conclusion. So then he goes to finally a sage who lives in the forest. And then he comes back the following weekend and he meets his congregant and he says to his congregant, well, you know, I've done some work for you. And the congregant says, well, tell me, do they play cricket in the world to come? And the rabbi says, well, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that they do play cricket in the world to come. The bad news is that you're opening the batting tomorrow morning.
Robert, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Oh, pleasure. You're listening to WonderLab, so fill your ear holes with nerdy goodness. Nerdy goodness.